Good afternoon. So I'm Tony McEntee from Electricity North West. I'm the Class Implementation Manager. With me today are Paul Turner, who's our Delivery Manager on Class, and the colleagues from Baringa, Tom Harper and Chris Collins. So I'd like to thank you for joining this webinar on Class. The agenda today, I'll just give a brief summary of what we're looking to cover. For the first part, I'll just give a very brief summary of Class and the purpose of the project extension that we're currently working on. And then for the main part of the presentation, my Baringa colleagues will go through their preliminary findings of the market analysis that they've been doing. I'll then go through the next steps for the project, and then we'll start the Q&A session. As we mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, you can log them during the call, and then we'll look to answer them at the end of the session. We'll be looking to present for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be sort of 20 to 30 minute session at the end to answer the questions. And we'll look to answer as many questions we can. If any that we don't get to, we'll look to answering those at a later stage and putting them on our website. So there'll also be a recording of the webinar on the website for people to listen to at a later stage. I'd just like to give a very brief summary of Class and the original project that we had. As the original project, we tried to look at the premise that if we reduce voltage on the network, that resulted in a reduction in demand. And part of the project was to actually prove that and to see if there's a predictable relationship between reducing voltage and then looking at the effect on demand. And part of the project showed there was a defined relationship that was predictable. And so that was a very important finding. But one of the other key points is to look at is whether or not customers could actually perceive these changes in demand and whether or not it was noticeable by them. And again, there was an extensive piece of customer research that went on which showed there was no actual observed sort of customer reaction to actually undertaking these sort of processes on the system. So that was sort of very good findings we got from that project. We also looked at key things to say whether or not these activities provided sort of adding adverse impact on asset health, and again part of the project showed that there was no impact on asset health or impacts like that. And so the main things that we do on Class is we have over 300 primary substations. For those who are non-technical, primary substation is where we transform the voltage from 33,000 volts down to 11,000 volts. And from 11,000 volts we then feed that to our distribution substations to transform down to 240, 440 volts to normal sort of domestic most types of customers. And what we looking at doing is how do we reduce the voltage on, if we reduce the voltage on the high voltage network, that flows through to reduction in voltage for most of our customers, and consequently reduction in demand. And what we can do with this is we can actually reduce voltage and hence reduce demand fairly quickly. And so there are a number of potential services that we can offer, and particularly offer these services into the ancillary services market, which are used by National Grid to balance the system. And so if we look at the diagram of a primary substation, there's two main ways that we can reduce voltage. We can look at 11,000 volts, and we have what's called tap changes on these voltages, which control the voltage to a particular level, and we can tell the systems to reduce the voltage by a set amount, and they will then reduce. And these reductions actually happen sort of 20 times a day to actually maintain the voltage. It's just instructing the system to reduce voltage at a particular time. Another way that was trialled to actually get a very rapid reduction in voltage is to actually switch off one of the transformers for a short period of time, and that results in a fairly rapid reduction in voltage that's maintained for quite a short period of time. And again, that was shown we can switch out a transformer, we can reduce voltage and demand fairly quickly, and again the impacts of customers by doing that was not perceived. So there's some tools there on using existing distribution assets which potentially are very valuable in providing further services to the system operator to actually balance the system, which obviously can be potentially be very valuable as you move to a much more sort of flexible network and much more flexible plant coming onto the system and offer another tool to actually managing the system in a new way. So that gives a fairly brief overview of the original class project. What we didn't look at in the original project was that if we were to offer these types of services, what the impact could potentially be on people who currently provide those services and what are the wider impacts of those. And so what we look to do is have an extension to the project to start considering these aspects of the project rather than the more technical aspects. And so you see on this slide we set out some objectives as to what we're going to do as part of the assessment. It was look at what the market for these sort of services are, so what the impact of these on the services and what the potential benefit to GB customers are. And for that we asked sort of Baringa colleagues there to actually look at this and see what these potential impacts are. So what I'd like to do now, this is part of the main part of the feedback today. They've been working sort of extensively to try to look at these impacts, and now hand over to Tom from Baringa who'll start talking through their preliminary findings that got to date.
Thanks, Tony. Right, so before we get into the details of the impact assessment, we thought we'd give a bit of background to the balancing services markets that we're looking at. So you should all see slide 6 here with a wavy line across the top of it. Here we have a scenario for illustration of the system frequency on the transmission system. National Grid has a requirement to manage this frequency limit that's around 50 Hz, give or take a small margin, under its license with Ofgem. And so it's very interested in procuring products to manage this. So what we have, if you follow the blue line across the top, is what we call a frequency event. So in this situation, for example, we're calling it a large plant loss. So a large, say, thermal plant trips, and the system frequency starts to drop. And then at certain rates of change of frequency, things start to happen on the system, which have been pre-procured by National Grid. So the first of these is response, split into primary, which is a burst of energy for about 30 seconds, and then secondary, which is picks up from the primary and goes on for 30 minutes. And as Tony said, these are the time frames that we think class can operate within. Grid also procures reserve products, which can take a frequency role, but also are used for energy balancing purposes. So here we've got a fast reserve at the bottom, which is a 2-minute ramping product for a minimum duration of 15 minutes, and short-term operating reserve, which has a looser ramping, I guess, definition, but is preferred to be ramping in 15 minutes, and has a duration of up to 2 hours. So generally, National Grid will either have response turning itself on automatically or dynamically working against the frequency to maintain that frequency, whereas reserve, it will instruct through the balancing mechanism. So moving on to slide 7, we have these products in a bit more detail. Frequency response is split into the primary and secondary that I mentioned, but also high, which is the other direction. So if you say you lose some demand and the frequency tracks higher, Grid looks to procure services to turn down output, in essence. The incumbent providers of frequency response are split between what we call mandatory providers, which are generally thermal generators, pump storage generators operating in the balancing mechanism, and there's commercial provision through firm tenders, which are contracts procured forward. They consist of, again, pump storage, large thermal units who sell, say, a chunk of capacity at a time. More recently, diesel gensets, DSR providers, and aggregators. So it's a big market for National Grid, at about 20% of its annual costs for balancing services, at 174 million, and that doesn't include the, I guess, what you would label the preparation costs, the creation of headroom in the balancing mechanism to ensure that it has capacity available to adjust as necessary. Moving down, we have fast reserve. We've been through the ramp time and the duration. Here we mainly see pump storage units, at least in firm contracts selling forward. We know that thermal units offer in what we call optional contracts in the balancing mechanism, and we've seen a recent provision from a gas engine aggregator in the last couple of months too. And that's also quite a large market per annum, at 130 million for grid last financial year. Store is the market that people know quite well, given the interest from small gen sets. So yeah, the income providers there are gas and diesel engines, some gas turbines, OCGTs, biomass providers, again DSR providers and aggregators, and we've seen some large thermal units turn to the store market in recent years given declining spark spreads. Cost to grid of store is around 60 million. And then finally, reactive power. So as Tony said, Class can provide voltage services. We see grid spend about 72 million a year on this, mainly provided from large incumbents. There's some static compensation equipment, but there's a caveat on that, in that reactive power is quite a locational market. We know there's obviously demand for it in the southeast, but not necessarily in, say, E&W's network, for example. But overall, these are the products that we think Class could provide. We've checked with National Grid what it thinks, and it's minded to think that Class is eligible for these too. And in total, we're looking at a total market size of around 400 million. So a good chunk of what National Grid spends on balancing services a year, which is normally around 1 billion a year, give or take 100 million or so. So that's the background to what National Grid does and the products it procures to manage frequency and balancing, and Class's potential role within those. Stepping on to slide 8, I'd like to talk about how we've approached the extension project. Broadly, we've split this into 5 chunks, as it were. So first was to define the approach and exchange price and volume information with E&W and National Grid. So while there's a lot of public information on the value and size of the balancing services markets on Grid's website, it's taken a bit of, I guess, data manipulation and liaison with National Grid to understand what numbers mean what, in essence. Then we've conducted some quantitative analysis for the entry of Class. So we've basically built stacks of plant and then taken Class capacity and displaced capacity out of those stacks. But Chris is going to talk more about that in a second. Moving on, we're going to develop an interface for public use of this CBA tool, so the public can change levels of Class, prices of Class, and see what the impact is for GB PLC. And then the final stage is qualitative analysis and other aspects of Class market entry. So there we're looking at things like the impact on current flexibility providers and on security of supply, for example. And then we've got the final report, which will be available to the public at the end of May. So broadly, at the moment, we're kind of in between stages 2 and 3, and we have some initial analysis to share with you shortly. Slide 9 just focuses on the quantitative analysis, which has taken up, I guess, a lot of the time and thinking. At a high level, it's a bit like a CBA. So we construct a counterfactual. In the top left of this slide, we've labelled it the current situation, the 400 million of costs incurred by National Grid per annum. Then we take Class and put that into that situation, basically displacing current providers out of those markets to probably, likely create a reduction in costs for National Grid per annum. And we're doing that for a past market year, the year 14-15, where we have a complete set of costs, and 2027. The reason being that's a good year to show changes in the balancing services markets in terms of overall requirements, and also the different sorts of providers that we think will be on the grid at that stage. And then the saving in costs we're going to discuss in terms of pure savings, revenues to the Class provision itself, and the sharing of that with consumers. And then we're going to cover off the impact on displaced incumbents in terms of lost revenues and what that might mean for those incumbent strategies. So Chris, my colleague, will now discuss the initial results from this quantitative analysis in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom says, we're sort of between stages 2 and 3 at the moment, so we have some initial quantitative results. That said, we're in ongoing discussions with National Grid, who are providing us with some of the insights on the publicly available data, and they've agreed to sense check some of these numbers. So we're being slightly cautious about putting too much detail at this stage, but the final report and the final tool will include more. So just to reiterate, we're looking at 2 snapshots for this impact assessment or cost-benefit analysis. The historic one, which is the 2014-15 year, for which we have the full set of data, and 2027, which will effectively be the same analysis but with a different set of assumptions in terms of what's required by grid and what is in the stack providing those services. We're looking at the frequency response market, the fast reserve and store market. The analysis we're showing here is just going to be for frequency response for now. We started there because it appears to be the most valuable service, but the tool is actually going to be agnostic to that point. There's some points on this slide, but they refer to the next slide, so I suggest we move on to the next. So what we're looking at now is a frequency response stack. This is slightly artificial in a sense. This isn't directly available from National Grid, but what we've done is to create this stack from both the firm frequency response market data that is on National Grid's website, and also some inferred values for their mandatory procurement. So just to be clear, the frequency response is provided predominantly through both firm frequency response and the mandatory service, which is provided by the balancing unit thermals already on the system. So we've backed out the historic, so the 2014-15 volumes and prices for each unit. The mandatory in particular is bundled together into sort of price groups based on their holding fees and the other costs that Grid has to incur in order to make use of those mandatory providers. So as I say, there'll be as much detail as you should need in the tool to see those assumptions, and we'll give quite a lot of detail also in the report to explain what we're doing there. But in essence, the principle is quite simple here. What we're assuming is that class is coming in at a lower cost than the majority of that stack. There is an open question about exactly what price that should be bid in at. And again, the tool will be agnostic to that point, so the user will be able to select a range of prices to see the effect, and to insert a different range of volumes to see how that stack moves. But in essence, what we're doing is putting in something relatively cheap at the bottom of the stack and displacing something relatively expensive, and that's how we're determining what we're calling the primary direct impact of class. As I say, we're slightly cautious about talking about the specific numbers at this stage, and also about which plant will be displaced. But as you'll see from the top 2 charts, those blocks there do refer to specific units, certainly for the firm services. So that will be an output of the results. But we obviously want to confirm with National Grid that we are reflecting that fairly, because obviously that's a significant impact and something that we know that Ofgem is interested in understanding that effect. So the initial number that we have for the 200 megawatts, however, is something up to, we're saying, the order of £60 million in reductions as against that 400 million. There are some small simplifications in the model as it stands that we're still refining. So, for example, the 200 megawatts is currently in the tool as a flat availability, but in reality, we know that class has a bit of a shape to it depending on the time of day, because effectively the effectiveness of class is a function of the demand on the network at any one time. So we'll be looking at that, the way that plays with the demand that Grid has at those times of day. So the model is on an hourly basis, to allow you to see that effect. So I think that's probably all we need to say on that slide, except to say that 60 million, the way in which that goes through to consumers is assumed to be via the BSUOS charge. As I mentioned, the price at which the class is offered to grid will affect that. But there is the flip side that as Tony may or may not come to in this session, that there is obviously a pass-through to the consumer on the DUOS side as well. So that relationship will also be built into the tool. So any third party will be able to explore that dynamic. So on now on slide 12, we're looking the top left box is the consumer benefit, which is what I've been talking about. In terms of the other quantitative elements, we'll obviously be looking at the same analysis, but the flip side, which is not the consumer benefit, but the impact that displacement has on those incumbents. As I mentioned, that will be both in terms of the loss of revenue they incur and which of those plants are being affected. And that will also indicate whether that is coming from the mandatory provision or from the firm, for example. And that's particularly something we need to discuss with Grid to make sure we're reflecting that correctly. The other quantitative aspects we're looking to account for are the carbon impacts. So this is there's a few ways in which carbon emissions should be affected. The big one being the reduced need to hold thermal in part load and to be in ready state. There are others as well that we'll be exploring. And the other point is the network security impact. So as Tony mentioned, there is one mode of class involves tripping a transformer. So you're taking your network out of the N-1 state. And for the time that it's operating, you have a slightly less resilient network, or a less resilient network for a brief period of time. We haven't quantified this yet, but we do anticipate this to be small, both because the probability of a failure happening on a given substation at the same time is likely to be small, and also class will be able to reinstate a particular substation if a fault is detected to mitigate that impact. Nevertheless, to the extent that we can, we'll try to quantify that in the tool. And in terms of the qualitative elements on that slide, as Tony mentioned, the quality of service it should not be significant. So this is really the direct effects on consumers of this flexibility being employed, and the surveys of the original class work did seem to indicate that nothing was noticed, but we will be revisiting that in the report to explore what we think could at least in principle be the impact on consumers. The impact on transmission network reinforcement costs, in principle you could use a class type service to avoid transmission network peaks. That's not the way in which it's proposed to be used, so I suspect this line will be small, but we'll cover it in the report. The cash out impact on suppliers, so there is a possibility that we're pushing suppliers out of their balance positions. This is not a thing that's limited to class. This is a DSR point more generally, I think. So we'll be exploring that. And then probably the largest, most significant qualitative assessment will be the security of supply and capacity market impact. So we've been slightly overly simplistic in the original, in the quantitative side, in saying that there is a immediate impact on those incumbents in those ancillary service markets. They will, as being displaced, there's a number of things that can happen to them. They can be pushed into different markets. They can participate more in the wholesale market. They may close. That will all have an impact on the existing capacity market. It could affect the stack of that market, also the bidding strategies within it. So that's something we're going to explore. We're not proposing to be quantitative about that. Almost every aspect of that is quite sensitive to the input assumptions. For example, the capacity market itself, the modelling what the effect of changing participation will be is complicated. But we'll explore that and give as much detail as we can on a qualitative basis. There's also a number of conversations we've had on the provision of OC6, so the security requirement. there shouldn't be a detrimental impact, but that is something that we will explore as fully as we can. There's a few dynamics there which I suggest we don't go into now, but will be covered in the report. And just to, before we move on to the next slide, just to point out that the impact on incumbents and competing technologies, which we're going to quantify, we have also been asked to engage in conversations with those parties that may be affected. So we started those conversations. So I'll just hand over to Tom to give the initial sort of feedback that we're getting on that basis.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. So slide 13 with the speech bubbles kind of gives a bit of a flavour of the comments we've received to date. Broadly, I mean, we can let viewers read through those, but broadly we think the comments we've received to date split into three areas. One is the ownership of, I guess, the flexibility from class, the can we question, can we do this? Then there's the interaction with other flexibility providers who may be on the distribution network offering class. So, for example, the interaction with a DSR provider or someone using voltage management services in the first place, then having their service changed by class operating over the top of it. And then the other area is the impact on thermal or large BM units or transmission connector generation that form part of the much needed capacity margin, and respondents have said there that ancillary services make a key part of the revenue streams for those plants. So just needs to be considered, which is why we're going into the displacement angle and the qualitatively looking at the impact on security of supply there. So we were going to say actually here that if viewers, the audience do want to submit further points of view for consideration in the report, then Chris Collins' email address and my Tom Harper's email address are at the back of the report. So if you back of this slide pack, so if you feel that you would like to express a view, then by all means email us a summary of those, and that would be that would incorporate that.
Well, thanks, Chris and Tom, for that. So I recognise there's a lot of information been provided there, and this is part of the initial part of the dissemination of the work. Just to talk you through some of the next steps that we'll be going through there. Obviously, there'll be work now by Chris and Tom to actually complete the analysis and do the work and do the sort of produce a report. We will be holding a learning event where we will be going through a lot of this in more detail, and that's scheduled for the 27th of April in London. So we'll be communicating more details on that, but at that we'll be able to give obviously more detail. The report will be finalised by then, and we can give more sort of in-depth understanding, because recognise there's a lot of information being given today, but this is just really giving people an indication of types of information is going to follow from the work we've done so far. And then we will, as if Chris and Tom have said, we'll be publishing the report and the CBA tool for people to use and do their own analysis on that. That's with the original project direction, we indicate that will be by 31st of May. Obviously, if we can do that earlier, we will do. And then there's the final close down report from the project, which is again due by 31st of May. So I think one of the key events we've got is in April, where I think you recognise that these are, it's probably a new subject in some of these areas, and we can get across in a bit more detail the findings and the impact class might have on class type technologies on the existing market. So that's the end of the formal presentation part of it. I think, as we mentioned earlier, we're now moving into the Q&A stage, and you can submit written questions via the tab on the web portal, or alternatively you'll be able to dial with the keypad and use 01, and the question we put to the Arcadine operator to take that question to feed through to us. To put some faces to the panel, we'll just give a quick look at the people we've got here who'll be answering your questions. Obviously myself and Paul from Electricity North West, and Chris and Tom from Beringa. Before we go on to the question side, just a reminder that at the end of this, so there's an online sort of poll to see how you found this webinar. I think that would be quite useful if you could respond to that. It will help us on future events to see, you know, whether or not this has been pitched right and what we can do to improve any future events. So I would really appreciate if you could take time to complete that. And before we move on, then we'll put some contact details up as alluded to before, but we'll now hand over to Martin Arkadin for the Q&A session, and we'll look at the questions that are asked and try to sort of raise those.
Thank you. If you do have a question on the phones, please dial 01 on your telephone keypad now to enter the queue. Once your name is announced, you can ask your question. If you find it's answered before it's your turn to speak, you can dial 02 to cancel. So once again, that's 01 to ask a question on the phones, or 02 if you need to cancel. Alternatively, you can submit your questions via the Q&A section of the webcast. I'll now hand back to the room for the webcast questions.
Okay. Thank you. We've had a question which said, have you looked at whether the price that DNOs bid into the market will be regulated, and whether DNO's revenue from class services will be treated as regulated or unregulated revenue? We have been discussing this point with Ofgem. I don't know how familiar people are with our current licence. We do have elements in the current licence for value-added services where it does allow for services like this to be, they're not within the main, the current allowed revenue, but there's a mechanism there called value-added services, which means that there will be a revenue sharing, so that any revenues DNOs receive from these activities will be shared with its DOS customers. And there's a mechanism already agreed within the licence, and we'd look to utilising those sort of mechanisms so that any DNOs who employ this service, the benefits will be returned, or significant benefits will be returned to the customers in each DNO's area, in addition to any wider benefits that customers gain from the overall balancing system cost being reduced. So hopefully that will answer that question.
We have a question on what a CBA is, and a bit more of a background on the tool itself. So I may just cover that off now. So a CBA is a cost-benefit analysis. So what we're looking to do here is really ask the question of what benefit does a class-like service bring to either consumers or wider society, or any individuals within any individual stakeholders, and what are the costs of providing that service. So it's a fairly broad view of whether or not a particular project or intervention is a positive thing to do for someone. So what this tool is doing is, as I think Tom said earlier, is creating a baseline set of costs associated with National Grid providing ancillary services, then imagining a world in which class is providing a certain proportion of those services, and then determining whether or not the net effect of that, having class providing those services, is positive or not. And so the tool is really just trying to do that, and most of the mechanics of it in this particular case are associated with building up a stack of existing providers and making some reasonable assumptions about how that stack moves when you put class in there. So hopefully that clears things up.
Okay, we had a question of what type of loads are you targeting in class? In the original project, we looked at we trialled class on many types of loads, domestic, industrial, commercial, and a mixture. And we found we actually got a response on all load types. So class will be rolled out at all primary types, regardless of what the actual load type is. The only slight difference is you get a difference in response. So we did find you get a greater response for domestic loads as opposed to a mixed type or industrial.
I had a question about whether the slides will be available after the event. They will be available on the website in addition to the recording of the session as well.
We just have the second but one from the bottom, Andrew. There's a question about whether class can be used to reduce the peak demand and at the same time the TSO needs a power increase for balancing. So really this is a broad question. Well, I'll broaden it slightly and re-express. So this is whether class can provide services directly for the benefit of the DNO, so managing load at a local substation, and how that interacts with effectively the same service, providing providing something that National Grid wants. I think the short answer is that these shouldn't be provided by the same substation at the same time. We will be making notes in the report particularly where there are mutual exclusivities, both between what the DNOs need and what National Grid wants, but also between the services National Grid wishes to procure. So a lot of the numbers being used are quite conservative for that very reason, to make sure that there is sufficient capacity to do. If we're looking at doing multiple services, then that will take a conservative view on how that can be done.
Yeah. If I could just add to that, so we can carry out peak demand reduction at individual sites, but it is an individual site that you're probably going to require that. So in effect, it's going to have very little issue or response to the TSO or what they need to do. So the actual load level will be very low.
And the other thing I think to say is that remember that class is a portfolio response. You've got multiple substations which collectively provide the service. So if there is an issue on any individual substation that it happens to be near its local peak, there's no reason that class can't take that out and put another substation in its place. It's a fairly responsive service in that way.
I got a question here. Looking forward to receiving the tool in May, but will the CBA report include a sensitivity analysis of market impacts against for the volumes of class provided? So I guess we could talk a bit here about why we've picked 2027, which I think we'll probably get behind this question a bit. Basically, we're using 2014-15 in the current market analysis because we have a full rate set of volumes and prices from National Grid publicly available, and we've checked with Grid on how to use those numbers to create our stacks. Now we know that the balancing services markets are changing going forward, particularly because there's a lack of inertia on National Grid system. Therefore, it has to hold more response in particular, or it thinks it will, or it might have to procure, say, an enhanced form of response instead. So there's a few drivers there. It's the increasing penetration of solar and wind, but there's also other things happening in terms of like the largest plant, for example, increasing. We call the largest in-feed loss being Hinkley C, expected to connect around 25-26. Therefore, we've picked 2027 as a date that captures the increase in that in-feed loss, the penetration of more solar and wind, and also the provision of balancing services by new entrants, in particular more gensets that are coming online under the capacity mechanism, and batteries in particular. So in that respect, the future look should cover the larger volume requirements that Grid will have in the future, but also the new stack of providers that we anticipate coming online. What we're not doing at this stage is to vary the volumes that National Grid might require within those 2 years.
And in terms of the volumes of class that we're putting into that, into those 2 snapshot years, the reason we're looking at 200 megawatts is because that's what Electricity Northwest think they can achieve in the short term. Certainly for the 2027 view, we will be looking at larger volumes, and we haven't quite confirmed what's in the report, but I think it makes sense to show a range of volumes there. We could similarly do that for 2014-15, perhaps if people on the call think that's a useful thing to see. I know there is a question around how quickly the benefit to DNOs erodes as other participants come into the same market, so that might be a useful way of demonstrating that.
We had a question as to whether DNOs will be able to bid into the market at whatever price they want, either market price, or will they have to bid in at the cost-reflective price. Our expectation is, and some of the discussions had with Ofgem, is that we will bid in at a market price, reflecting the value of the service and how sort of effective and valuable grid think that service is, in the same way as any other product is viewed. And obviously over time, if there's a lot more class provision of services and potentially costs come down, then obviously those costs will probably tend to reduce. But we would expect to bid in at a market-related price, not at some other sort of price built up on a cost basis, but there are overall regulatory mechanisms which then return a significant amount of that back to the customers in the DNO area.
We've had some more questions on various sort of load types, but it's probably worth pointing in the direction of the class website, which can, for the original project, which shows some various reports carried out by the University of Manchester, which will be able to give you a bit more of an in-depth view on the load types and the effect of each type of load. You do have to remember these are the classes actually carried out at primaries, so it's not very often there is a mixture of loads anyway, but if we refer you to the University of Manchester, some of their reports will give you more detail there.
Did we cover very quick? Just want to make sure we covered how the service speed aligns with the product. So we stepped through response being a 10-second product and a 30-second product, and reserve being a 2-minute product, and I think the mechanisms, either the switching off of a half of a substation, that would be within primary timescales.
Yeah.
10 seconds.
Typically, when we switch out one of the transformers, we could expect to reduce the demand well within 10 seconds, which is the requirement of a primary substation, of a primary frequency response. And when we actually adjust the voltage, it's typically between sort of 20 seconds. Some slow change in transformers might take up to 2 minutes, but generally, again, it's within timescales of both the second response and the fast reserve sort of timescales. So we've got the capability to operate in sort of the current timescales, and on the primary, it can operate actually in less than a second, which is very fast compared to some of the existing providers of the service. So it is a very fast response potentially.
There are a few questions here that relate to, well, actually, if I just summarise, there's one that says, how do you manage the undervoltage problem which occurs, naturally coincides with peak demand? And there's a query around whether class works for constant power load. I think, in a sense, these cover the same, are dealt with by the same answer, which is that the purpose of class is to monitor each primary substation in real time, effectively, and determine what response can be achieved from that particular substation, from that particular transformer, and aggregate up as required to deliver the service. So if indeed there are loads that don't show the relationship between voltage and demand, that will be monitored as part of the system, so that won't be a surprise. That's precisely what the system should be doing. And similarly, if a network is already at its low voltage state, then that substation will have less to contribute to the overall effect. So the point being that at a portfolio level, you can guarantee, on a risk-adjusted basis, you can guarantee a certain response. And what is being offered to National Grid because of that is deliberately conservative, and there's potentially more capability for any given minute than you would promise to offer ahead of time. I slightly defer to Electricity North West for the technical clarification on that. But.
Yeah, no, that is correct. Yeah, so every site will will highlight the actual response expected during that half an hour period, and that will be taken into account the demand type for that site.
We've had a question on are we planning any further work to improve the accuracy assumptions on estimate GB scale? I think the original project did some work there. I think what we're focusing on now is the market impact, and obviously it's then for each DNO then to determine, I think, what the whether or not they would get the same capability on their network. We're obviously refining our assessment as well, and as some of the other answers suggested, it's something that we would refine as the system rolled out as to what the level of response that we get at a particular time. So it will be to an extent dynamic, and we wouldn't be looking particularly to redo the work that was done in the original class project, which actually identified the potential for GB scale rollout.
We've had a question on feedback from. Is there any feedback from National Grid on whether class to be bid on an hourly varying capability, and how far in advance would the class service capability need to be confirmed? I guess this comes down to the market structures that we're dealing with here. A number of the response markets are either procured forward on a monthly basis or in real time by National Grid systems from BM units. Now, as we understand it in current conversations with National Grid, class won't have its own BM unit, so it won't be considered as similarly to say like a CCGT. So it will be participating in the forward markets, which do require you to state your capability up front. Now, given that the size of the prize could be quite large with class in terms of both on the ENW's network. When I say size of the prize, I mean for GB consumers, could be a reduction in costs, both from ENW's network, but from a national response overall. There is a question as to whether National Grid should have an interest in real-time monitoring what is available on distribution networks at any one time, and then using that on a dynamic basis. But the structure of the current markets are very much what the discussions we've been having revolve around, and how our analysis works too.
Yeah, the other point probably raised is that the current thinking, the way that we deploy class in the short term or short to medium term, is to configure how it operates based on the current product, so that the current requirement are things like fast reserve, so primary and secondary frequency response. But class does offer a capability to actually do something completely different, and part of the development that we'd look to continue sort of post or an initial implementation is, so how can the sort of capability that class offers actually provide something completely different to what is currently required to actually enable the system to operate better and to deal with the sort of the wide changes in the amount of demand and the types of demand and generation that are connected to the system. So that's part of one of the real benefits of class. It actually offers a potential for a real game-changing way of actually understanding as how we actually deliver some of these requirements, even though we may deploy initially to mimic sort of current sort of generation type capability.
So we've had a question on how could members of the public get more detail about the system planning steps carried out in the project? Would you be or have you issued any report on this? I guess system planning can be interpreted a couple of ways. But the system planning that relates to this cost-benefit analysis, the impact assessment, is National Grid's system planning in terms of the volume of balancing services that it plans or says that it will need over both the short term and the long term. We use it for the current market assessment. We're using a previous year, so we've seen what National Grid needed volume-wise and what it paid price-wise over time. In the future, we're relying on National Grid's forecasts of what it needs, which are largely based on the system operability framework that was published in November 2015 for response, and based on some Bringer internal projections for reserve. We'll be publishing those inside the report.
Right, well, thank you very much. I think that we've had a very sort of lively session there with lots of questions. So thank you again for your participation, and hope most of you will be able to join us when we hold the event in London in April. I'd like to ask you again to sort of complete the feedback form on the website. I think that on the end of the webinar, we'll get some feedback as to how this has been received, and so we can improve any future webinars that we do. Again, thank you very much for your participation. I think now we'll sign off and thank you. Goodbye.
This now concludes the webcast. Thank you all very much for attending. You may now disconnect, and once again, if you can fill out the survey, we'd be very appreciative of your feedback.